of federal key executives. Scott Hastings of Deepwater Point is going to moderate our first panel of fellow government leaders. Scott served for 23 years in the federal government, beginning his career in the Department of Justice and Immigration and Naturalization Service. When the INS was restructured and became part of the Department of Homeland Security, he was appointed to be the first CIO of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He then moved to be the CIO for the U.S. Visit Program, which has become one of the most successful programs in the department. Scott now uses his knowledge and federal government expertise to direct and guide his clients. Please join me in welcoming Scott Hastings.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be a part of this. I'm going to have to dig deep for the knowledge, but we'll do our best. Fortunately, I'm saved by having a great panel who I'd like to get up here and introduce right away so we can get started. First, Ms. Iris Cooper. Iris is the Executive Director, Office of Acquisition Operations in the Veterans Administration, and oversees business and contracting solutions for a variety of major programs. So a key enabler for Mr. Baker over there to apply technology in Veterans Affairs. Steve Kemp. Steve is the Commissioner for the U.S. General Services Federal Acquisition Service, I guess since July of 2010, and is a key driver of a number of initiatives that Ms. Johnson spoke of. And a well-known face to us all, Shemendra Paul. President Obama appointed Shemendra as the program manager for the information sharing environment in July 2010. He oversees the build-out and manages the use of information services sharing environment, big focus on data. Scott Well, if you're in the audience in the House, Scott, I wasn't sure that you were here, but thanks for joining us. Scott currently serves as the Chief Financial Officer and Assistant Secretary for Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce. His portfolio includes strategy formulation, execution of the departmental budget, the Human Capital Office, and serves as the Chief Acquisition Officer for procurements of over $2 billion in goods and services. Well, welcome to the conference, and thanks to everyone for your interest. We who organized the conference were overwhelmed by the participation. The list kept growing and growing right up to the very end. I think we've got over 550 folks here today, 2/3 of you from the government. So clearly we've tapped an item of interest for us all, and it doesn't surprise me. It is clear that the subject matter is timely, and that new issues in acquisition, budgets, and technology delivery are common concerns to the acquisition professionals, financial officers, and IT solutions professionals, all of whom are represented in this conference. The panel is designed not only to address the broader themes of the conference, but to focus as best we can on pragmatic issues that agencies are wrestling with on a daily basis. All of us on this panel, whether in the private sector or government, are experiencing dramatic changes in how technology solutions are being architected, delivered, and managed. At the same time, new emphasis on costs drives us all at a time when shrinking federal budgets appear to be a reality for some time to come. Finally, and this is key, I think the nature of the federal workforce is apparent to us all will soon reflect new buying habits and customer expectations as younger people who have grown up in the mobile solutions world will expect that to be adapted to meet their needs as government employees. Virtual services, agile development processes, and new outsourcing strategies are just a few expectations that the participants in this conference will have to meet due to the changing of the workforce. Most of these issues have forced information technology and procurement officials to work together to craft new approaches to acquire technology. We're hoping on this panel to drive out some specific examples and experiences that can illustrate how agencies are responding successfully and also what lessons may have been learned in the process. The panelists and I will try and directly address some of these issues, hopefully with both real and relevant experiences in their own organizations, and also insights into general trends and solutions with which they are familiar in other environments. We'll encourage audience members to participate at the end of the panel discussion and hope that some of the initial issues we will cover will generate questions you have or generate experiences you can share. So, let's dive in. There seems to be an increased emphasis, well, let's take on this workforce issue to begin with. There seems to be an increased emphasis on creating a balanced workforce. Insourcing is now a term that is circulating the Beltway. And moving to small business and IT acquisitions, how do these two expectations impact your acquisition strategies, or if at all? And can we start this off with Iris?
Yeah, let me address what we have done to deal with the workforce issue before I go to the small business piece. A couple years ago, we came to the conclusion that we needed an IT-centric acquisition workforce, and we stood up the Technology Acquisition Center in Eatontown, New Jersey. And I still thank the Army for their contribution of an experienced workforce. But instead of just having another buying office, we have three major components in our workforce. Acquisition Rapid Response Service. Those are procurement analysts and technical people who can help our in-house customers develop their requirements. That is one of our major challenges. And I'm sure we're not the Lone Ranger out there. Contracting folks, but we also have a program advisory service. They provide IT risk analysis of our programs. So we as an office, as an acquisition organization, can provide life cycle acquisition support and not just buying as usual. Don't drop your PR and we'll go buy. This is we're involved from the minute you need something till the minute it is, the sustainment phase ends. So completely different concept. We're still educating our customers. So that's a major challenge, and educating industry. So I think that's been extremely successful. The small business component for us in the VA is a little different because of Public Law 109461. We do have the opportunity to give special considerations to service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses, which we clearly take very seriously. That's part of our mission. And as an example, T4, the Transformation Total Technology contract we awarded last year, $12 billion IDIQ. We did 1 year outreach and market research to make sure we could design a teaming arrangement to let SDVOSBs and VOSBs participate. We were very successful. Out of the 15 contracts, seven went to small business.
Scott, if I might put you on the spot, you own the human capital portfolio and the budget portfolio. A piece of this balanced workforce is the notion that we should examine, first of all, what's appropriate to contract out and what is inherently a federal responsibility. That's going to involve discussions from a budget standpoint about how are the dollars best managed to meet surge requirements, et cetera. And it certainly changes the calculation in terms of long-term budgets when you make a hire decision as opposed to a contracted resource position. Are these issues ones that you're wrestling with in your portfolio?
I'd say three particular areas of focus with respect to our acquisition workforce. I'm going to use the definition of acquisition broadly. First, from the perspective of simply numbers and workflow. Within the theme of integration of a number of different acquisition reform initiatives. When we first came into office, there was the administration put into the President's budget for fiscal year 11 a significant investment in hiring more people, and as the budget climate became what it is, and the question very quickly became that we're not going to have millions of new dollars simply to hire more people. So let's look at the people we have and let's deconstruct what they're doing. Well, it became clear, as we were also at the same time looking at strategic sourcing, is that we had our acquisition workforce basically producing almost 200 separate contracts to more or less buy the same personal computer across 12 different bureaus. So as we were able to implement strategic sourcing for personal computers, for example, that's now one contract with one unit administering, liberating the rest of our acquisition workforce to focus on higher value activities. So the language of strategic sourcing and workload to make our acquisition workforce more productive. Second, in defining acquisition beyond mechanics of procurement to the broader perspective, which is the CFO and a chief human capital officer, in addition to acquisition, is something I'm very interested in. The question of how do we best manage acquisition risk for our mission critical acquisitions, and how do we encourage the management of that proper program management and acquisition risk within our bureaus as well. And what became, so as we start defining our acquisition and program management resources, our human capital, there was no number. We didn't know. How many people actually are certified acquisition program managers trained in managing acquisition risk? Now we know. How are they inserted into our planning, our requirements definition, budgeting, key milestones when it comes to budgeting, and acquisition execution process? We're now integrating and aligning those resources more clearly. All right, so let's have our acquisition workforce, particularly those trained beyond the mechanics of buying PCs into the broader question. How do we relieve the burden of duplication that you have when, say, buying 200 PC contracts across 12 bureaus? How do we liberate that workforce and then provide the training? And not just training, a lot of people have training, but how do you insert that workforce into decision making, into requirements definition, into independent cost analysis in a way that's highly meaningful for decision making and execution? Part number 2. And part 3 with our acquisition workforce is in better linking our business community, our business customers essentially, the American business, to federal procurement opportunities. We developed, actually under the President's Mission, Business USA, which is integrating the hundreds and hundreds of individual services, including federal acquisition services and opportunities, and putting it on one common platform that no wrong door, so that any small business interested, small disadvantaged business or any business seeking to do business with the government can be injected into a greater understanding of the opportunities that are available, all from one place.
Thank you. Let's switch to the changing environment of technology solutions. I don't think there's a more creative sector in this country than the application of technology to business, which is a wonderful thing theoretically, but a very frustrating and difficult thing to keep up with, both from the standpoint of the technology professionals who are trying to apply technologies to operations in the mission spaces, and the acquisition workforce, who are constantly challenged, I think significantly so at this point, hence the conference, with, okay, I get it, how to buy a totally owned and operated IT infrastructure in a mission area, but now I'm expected to look for virtual services that the mission owner doesn't own and operate. We're looking at information sharing initiatives. What does that mean for me, my security postures, etc. And so we happen to have, I think, a perfect person to speak to some of these issues. So to the extent that these solutions are moving dramatically in a world that's consolidating infrastructure, relying more and more on virtual services provided by external services to the mission owners, and the moves to a more mobile environment, as Ms. Johnson mentioned, do we have acquisition strategies that can keep pace with this change in the solution sets and continue to support the operational requirements? Shemendra, maybe you could take this on as a first shot.
Sure, thank you. as we look at what we're trying to do with the information sharing environment to accelerate terrorism, homeland security, weapons of mass destruction related information sharing, whole of government across the federal government with our state and local partners, with the private sector, internationally, it's critical to take a holistic view, looking at standards-based approaches and trying to mature these standards and then leverage procurement acquisition policy. So, a great example of this is some of the work that we're doing partnership with GSA and with ACT-IAC to develop some recommendations for OMB's consideration around how do we better do standards-based procurement. Many of you may be familiar with something called the National Information Exchange Model, or core standards frameworks for data interoperability information exchange. As these standards frameworks mature up, we're able to work with industry in effective ways to support interoperable solutions out of the box. A great example is the Federal Bureau of Investigation flagship initiative called NDEX, National Data Exchange. It connects 18,000 local police departments to share information to keep the country safe. 90% of these police departments have 50 or fewer sworn officers. They don't have necessarily the same sort of sophistication to do customized solutions that you might find at a place like FBI or ICE or so forth. So it was critical to make this work, to have a standards-based approach, working with industry, and it's paid off. The original cost estimates were about $250,000 to interface these legacy records management systems these police agencies have with NDEX. Because of the standards-based approach, the cost on average now is under $10,000, 25 to 1 drop. That's the value of standards and standards-based approaches. And we're looking to scale up those sort of lessons learned more broadly. An interesting example. How many folks have seen the movie Ghostbusters? Who wants to shout out the big public safety innovation in Ghostbusters? Anybody? It's early, but there was a lot of coffee outside. Yeah, that's our Marshmallow Man. Now, it's the proton pack. Right? Remember the proton packs they had in their back? So, what was the number one rule with the proton packs when they had their guns out?
Don't cross the streams.
Never cross the streams. Well, see, but that's the challenge we have today. I go back to what Administrator Johnson said earlier, right, about stovepipe solutions. We don't cross the appropriation streams. We're locked into a culture where, if we don't innovate, if we don't open our eyes, if we don't lift up, we're condemned to continue forward with stovepipes. Well, part of what we're trying to do, Turco, myself, others, is develop approaches to leverage standards to break down those stovepipes, and then leverage procurement policy to be able to take advantage of those standards. So we're trying to cross the streams.
So, as a practical matter, I'm on the ground floor now, and I've been a 14 or 15 buyer of services for my boss in Mission Space X. And they felt really comfortable because when something goes wrong, they know that they can walk down to one floor. I generally was not on the top floor, and they can ask questions about why this or why that has failed. We're in an environment now where I get the notional enablement initiatives that you're speaking of. But you mentioned one key issue, for example. I'm now, if I'm going to adopt the use of external services provided, for example, by the Federal Acquisition Service, I'm going to adopt a service that's maintained by another mission area that I'm utilizing, that may often be subject to issues that I am no longer in control with. So, for example, different appropriations committees may be overseeing both those investments. I'm going to want to be assured that those investments continue to fund the capability, and I'm not going to be caught short because I've invested in something that I don't have any control over. I could go on the list of naysaying issues that the folks on the ground floor are trying to deal with. I want to ask Steve, you're right in the middle of this, developing these services, trying to develop constituencies for their use, and I'm assuming proselytizing the confidence building in terms of the people who are intended to buy. I mean, do you think, it seems to me a CIO or a chief acquisition officer in the agencies are going to have to do a bit of, they're going to have to adopt and buy into this, but convince their mission owners that this is a good idea. Do you see that as a trend, and are we really ready to take on the additional perceived risk? Where are we in this continuum in terms of being able to do this?
Sure. I think the place I would look to see how far we've come is the Strategic Sourcing Working Group that was chartered by OFPP and the Chief Acquisition Officers Council. And if you look where they are now compared to where they've been over the last several years, I think this has been going on for maybe 8 years or so. But I think in the last year or two, you've seen some of these solutions really take off. And it's not just the solutions, but the agency interest and participation. We're closing out on the wireless contract. And one thing that's really stuck out to me as this has moved forward is the agency's willingness to participate at the beginning and sign up and say, I'm going to be on board when this gets awarded. And also the people working on this. We used to start these groups across the government, and people would come to the first meeting or two and then disappear. This wireless group has been meeting constantly, and in fact, I think the team has grown. And I think that shows the interest of the agencies in participating. And the second piece of this is that, I've been challenging our organization to be innovative and create solutions and create a little bit of buzz around them. And I said, we want to be like the next iPad, and people lined up waiting, around for when the solutions come up. And we see that with the wireless. We've had calls from others saying, hey, when's it going to be? You're a little bit late, and when is it going to be out there? We don't normally hear that. It's usually we have to go to agencies and beg them to use it once we awarded the contract. Now people are waiting because they want the savings. They're waiting to get into the solutions, and they're depending on us to deliver those. So I think the thirst for collaboration, the need for the savings that this brings, and the way we talk about GSAs, the more for the mission, it's important. This is the way that you get, you can find more money to do the things you need to get done, and not put your resources into them, or not put many resources into them. And the government gets a great deal. I think Scott's example is great. Let us do the office supplies, let us do the wireless, and focus on that thing that you need to do intra-agency, and put your resources there. It's leveraging the procurement, it's leveraging the collaboration, and it's delivering more for the mission in many ways that are useful to the agency, the taxpayer, and the overall effectiveness of the government.
Are those of you who are sitting in the customer agencies, are you finding it difficult? I think at the top levels in your positions, there is an understanding that this is a viable strategy and it's here to stay. As you try and push that down to the buyers, are you finding adoption? Where are we on that maturity roadmap?
Yeah, let me answer that. I think it's not so much the buyers. I can convince my workforce that we cannot afford not to do strategic sourcing. It makes their job easier. It streamlines how we buy. It reduces the cycle time. There's a lot of advantages for the buyer. It's the customer. It's the internal customer to convince them that, no, you can no longer have your favorite contractor. It doesn't work that way anymore. So there is a whole educational piece on the customer side, but I think we're making progress.
You wanted to jump in on this too.
We are just in a remarkably fertile time for this type of acquisition reform. We're in a budget climate. Being again, respectful of this Chief Financial Officer in addition to Chief Acquisition Officer, you don't have to do a lot of convincing with the bureaus or line offices that make up a department, or the folks who are closer to the programs whose budgets are facing reductions or terminations. That, hey, if we can save $25 million by going from 200 PC contracts to one, and you up front design the requirements of the 4 flavors of PC that we're going to have, and you get the savings, that versus terminate my program, that versus having to do horrible things with my workforce, what changes very quickly is, and Mr. Kemp was referring to, that there's suddenly a climate of when is it happening? How do I get in on helping to define the requirements? Why aren't you going fast enough? And if there's any question, it is, okay, if I give up control and we go to this master contract, strategic sourcing contract, how do I know that they'll actually be delivered? How do I know that the vendor will show up with my office supplies when I need them? And if you can convince them and show them and work with them on the training, on the implementation, the fear factor that Ms. Johnson was speaking to, just takes. The people in the programs have to deliver.
So I
And we have to be able to deliver for them.
I get the strategic sourcing as a probably easier to adopt. I wanted to go to Shemendra and just expand this discussion more to the, so you're dealing with sharing data,
Yeah.
and which is a lot more, it brings with a lot more issues. How are you finding the adoption factor in terms of what you're engaged in?
Yeah, so I mean, the issues that you're bringing up, Scott, that Administrator Johnson brought up, my fellow panelists, the budget situation is the key macro driver. At the federal level, they're flat, starting to decline. In my space, Homeland Security, National Security, it's been 10 years of increasing budgets. So at the federal level, it's changed. It's much worse at the state and local level. Key constituency for my office and the work we do, they're being crushed by the budget cuts. Public safety, law enforcement area. I think last year was the first time ever the number of police officers in this country declined because of the budget situation. My boss, Director Clapper, has a saying he attributes to Ernest Rutherford, a famous physicist, New Zealander. He was involved with New Zealand government activity in the 1920s, and basically it goes like this: when the money runs out, you have to start thinking. So we have to start thinking. I think that's what Administrator Johnson challenged us to do. It can't be business as usual. Now, in my stakeholder community, I see two trends. One is I deal with a lot of very strong, independent organizations, distinguished histories and core operating responsibilities in this country to keep us safe. At the same time, there's an awareness that the problems we face as a society are cross-boundary. Nobody can solve terrorism information sharing by themselves, law enforcement information sharing by themselves, Homeland Security information sharing by themselves. These are collaborative efforts across domains of government, across levels of government, to the private sector. And so there's a realization that we have to take common approaches. Those approaches have to be based on agreements, on common minimum standards based on shared mission activities. So there is a movement, there is an awareness. There's also the cultural issues and the traditional issues, and it's our jobs as leaders to kind of help folks work through those. There are areas where it's going well. I'll give you another example. Is a suspicious activity reporting nationwide, the Nationwide SAR initiative. How many folks came here in the Metro today? So how many saw if you see something, say something signs, or, that's the public awareness component of the Nationwide SAR initiative. The Secretary called the town out, she's out in front. But, as vocal as she is about it, the program actually is housed at the Department of Justice. FBI is a key player. 200,000 frontline officers have been trained in the behavior-based standard. They're reporting through the National Infusion Centers. We're on track to get 400,000. This only works because there's national standards that are supported by industry that folks can procure through independent decisions. They don't need to go and to one person, one bottle line. It's a common approach. It's a creative use of procurement policy, of standards to drive information sharing.
But I think what several of you have said is there's no better encourager to participation than being able to look at successful initiatives. And I think that's why this conference is important, that we're able to share where is it that we can look to see things that have actually worked in real terms. I know that that's the best answer that people says, well, where can I pick the tires and what you're saying. Let me switch to a slightly different topic. One of the things that I see in terms of technology solutions trends and actually how we move out in terms of applying those, there seems to be on the technology cycle an adoption of new processes that break down larger requirements into incremental, measurable outcomes and purportedly mitigate risk. That does several things. It provides quicker, more immediate, measurable operational awareness and obviously customer buy-in from a monitoring standpoint in terms of investment management. You don't go as far down the path before you can make changes. It has seemed to me, and as I go back into my old colleagues' environments, one of the issues, though, I think it falls squarely on the shoulders of the acquisition shops. Because if you don't get this right, it seems to me you're going to cause more cycles, more procurement cycles. You're by definition, some of the structures I've seen have been very onerous in terms of, yeah, I'm only going to put out a $12 million requirement, there's no guarantee of a follow-on. That does several things. It falls on the shoulders of the acquisition shops in a dramatic way, and I think it causes a great deal of concern in the solutions provider community, the private sector, that says, gee, how can I afford to operate like that, and how is this going to pan out? A, are you experiencing that in your own environments? And B, what do you have to say about the issues on that topic? Are we going to be able to get through this with some new strategies from an acquisition standpoint? Or am I overemphasizing the issue here? Iris?
I can address the degrees. As most of you probably know, Roger Baker has heavily advertised the implementation of PMAS, where you have to deliver a customer-facing solution every 6 months. So we get away from these huge programs that we can't manage and that ultimately fail. We have built the acquisition strategy with our partners in OIT, so we have the either optional plans or flexible instruments that allow us to do that. We do a lot of industry education, we do a lot of vendor outreach so the vendors know what risk is out there because we do understand the impact of that. And we try to build it in a way that allows us maximum flexibility while giving total transparency. So it seems to be working for us.
Scott, I wanted to get your input because I know you're very much involved in the investment review process of some of these programs. What are you seeing in terms? One of the keys for this is if you shrink these development times and purportedly mitigate risk, are the investment review boards willing to push out some of the risk in terms of key decision points, or are what do you see in terms of the whole impact on the governance and investment management of this strategy?
I'm a believer in OMB Circular 11 Part 3. I'm a believer in using phasing the steps to mitigate risk. I would say I'm a believer in the IT dashboard and its great utility as I co-chair our Commerce Information Technology Review Board in reviewing the large acquisitions made, which are IT, but not exclusively. In terms of there are other risk reviews for non-IT projects. I would say that, and I would say this, embracing the excellent spirit and excellent work of our colleagues at OMB, that our review board, our review process and our dashboard tends to have this a priori assumption of waterfall, big projects, waterfall flows, and then tracking the risk and progress versus those. And that's great. But as we see more agile development, as we see more of these bite-sized deliverables, we have a question as we look at our own mission-critical projects. Is our project review, the way we're reporting this up into our dashboards, does it fit more of an agile approach? Or are agile projects, because they change, and quick change is often seen as a sign of risk, does the reporting process itself distort the actual risk profile? But on the other hand, just because it's agile doesn't mean it's well managed. And so the way I think we're moving toward a promising area of refinement for these more traditional waterfall-based programs and measuring risk and progress. And I think we have more work to do in terms of taking this principle of agile project development and having a commonly understood and agreed upon framework for assessing program management, whether it's good or bad, and a more flexible phase and chunk-based agile approach.
Kshemendra, I would look at some of the things that you're trying to do as an enabler of more agile development. And you've been kicking around these issues for a long time. What are you seeing in terms of, if you're successful in the kinds of services that we're standing up that can be reusable, shouldn't the end user be able to get to the goal line quicker with actual mission capability? And do you see any trends in terms of how we're allowing that to
Yeah, sure. I second what Scott's saying about what OMB's doing with its focus on the IT dashboard and program oversight. I'm a big believer in phasing and always be focused about delivering some end user capabilities. We just talked about it's a big risk in any kind of development systems. You get disassociated with end user requirements and things drift. So it's always important to stay grounded. My experience from the time I was at OMB as the federal chief architect, when I was at DOJ, before in the private sector, my current role, these large IT systems have two things that drive maybe 80% of the risk and 60% of the cost. Two real big things. One is the legacy interfaces, and this goes to the thing that Mr. Johnson was talking about with legacy system modernization in government. It's a given. It's a huge risk here. It's these legacy point-to-point interfaces to move information around. And the second is homegrown identity, credential, and access management approaches. And this is something that GSA is putting a lot of emphasis on, the Federal Identity, Credential, and Access Management Roadmap for the CIO Council. So to the extent that we can start to develop common approaches to deal with legacy interfaces and move away from point-to-point interfaces towards reused interfaces that are more effectively managed, it's going to accelerate agile approaches. Because the agile approaches are focused on developing an application capability on top of your legacy infrastructure. At the end of the day, the data is the gasoline that drives those app engines. So those are things that we're focused on. GSA is focused on. The CIO Council is focused on, and we think that there are opportunities as we go forward. I can give you an example. I talked about the nationwide SAR initiative earlier. A key issue with that is the privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights considerations. We're talking pretty sensitive stuff. So we went through a phasing approach, developed an initial capability, did an evaluation of our effort at 12 fusion centers, brought in the ACLU, EPIC, Electronic Frontier Foundation, all of the advocacy groups, went through a process to tighten the behavior-based standard to make sure that it's really about behavior that's reasonably indicative, pre-operational criminal planning, terrorism-related activity. Did it in a transparent way, which is key too in these methods, to make sure that you're collaborating across a broad set of stakeholders. That it's counterintuitive. Sometimes that adds a little bit of time up front, but it dramatically factors risk and it gets you a better solution going out. So because of that process, we've been able to scale up what we're doing in a way that fits within our federated democracy and constitutional system of government, protecting privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights. So it's the piloting approach, chunking things, and bringing in all different stakeholders.
Steve, let me bring you into this discussion and probably put you on the spot right here because you're so good at responding. You're at the crossroads of a lot of these issues, a lot of these capabilities. You're dealing with probably positive and negative feedback on a daily basis. Could you talk a little bit about these issues from your point of view, particularly if you've got places to look that you know? I'm very aware of VA, for example, in terms of trying to change the way they do business. Are there other areas that you see in GSA that we can look to who are dealing with the same kinds of issues that Scott and Andrew have talked about?
Sure. I mean, I don't even have to look beyond the Federal Acquisition Service and some of the challenges that we face with our own internal systems. I mean, I think, all of you that are in the industry deal with our systems and they could be better. Those of you who are customers would like a better Advantage, would like a better eBuy, those kinds of tools that are out there. You'd like to get better data from us about what you're spending with us, about what industry is providing. And, and we're moving into that and moving through and upgrading our systems that have been around since the 80s. They're on mainframes, they're using COBOL, and we're doing this in a way that it's incremental. We've looked at this and said, we need to start turning off things, we need to start delivering. We can't wait to, do a 10-year upgrade of the system and then reveal it one day and you're all on. So we're doing pieces and rolling them out, turning systems off. And it's very expensive to run these at the same time. Building the new system while you're managing an operation that takes in about 10.5 million bits of data, pieces of data every day. You've got to run the business and you've got to improve the business. So and I think what we're doing is is indicative of the way I think agencies need to. And you know, when we roll it out, it isn't perfect. It never is. So we've been piloting, you know, internally and externally on the schedules and some of the other systems we do. And then it's a quick turnaround to fix what isn't quite working the way, or things we didn't anticipate as we rolled it out. But I think, you know, one of the things that's really valuable out there, and it's not just in GSA's contracts, it's this task order contracting. And I think the government really hasn't taken advantage of the true value of them, because, you know, one of the things that was envisioned when these came into place was they're quick in, quick out. So if, you know, and I think too often the acquisition professionals have turned these task order contracts into full and opens. That wasn't what was expected. Now, you know, distinguish this from, you know, $8 and $10 million orders and an $100 million effort. You're going to do $150 million, $200 million effort under a task order contract. You ought to take some time and you ought to be very thoughtful about that. But when you're doing quick turnaround, $2 million, $8 million, $10 million, this shouldn't be like a, you know, full and open competition using, you know, those kinds of paradigms. You know, it ought to be, you know, quick interaction with industry, a quick evaluation, confident, but it wasn't never meant to be this long drawn out process. And I think that's really important, you know, that these things can happen relatively quickly. They can be competed very quickly, whether it's like a T4 contract and you're having much success with that, or a schedule or a GLAC or somebody else's multiple award contract. And then you want to think about the back end of this too. You know, so when you're planning up front, you want to think about how we get out of this. You know, are we going to be tied into this forever? What happens if this doesn't work? And I think that's where this process comes in, that you can get out of this stuff if you need to. And you need to think about that too. And you can pull the plug, and I think that's the value of this, that you don't have to think about pulling the plug once you've invested $120 million. You can pull the plug once you've invested $200,000 or $2 million, when you just see this isn't going to work for you. I mean, and nobody starts a project thinking it isn't going to work, but it does happen from time to time. And I think you need to figure out, you know, what's going to be the strategy, either for going on or turning off. And there's a lot of places you can check in on that with milestones and take advantage of that.
It's this kind of discussion that I think we all understand has to happen between the CXOs to enable the mission to move forward. I think in much of my career, I don't see, I guess I didn't see that amount of collaboration between the CXOs to get jobs done. They tended to be within their own portfolios. I don't see any way out in today's environment of a much closer collaboration between the procurement community, the budget community, the HR community, and the IT community. Keying off, and I do want to get to the audience, so I'll just get a quick response from each of you on this. Administrator Johnson talked about risk and the need for us to be able to adopt some risk to move some of these initiatives forward. She referenced the Mythbusters effort as an attempt to kind of demystify things and help people be able to adopt risk. If you look at the CXO community across CIO, putting you all on the spot here, Chief Acquisition Officer, Chief Procurement Officer, and you gave them this community is actually loosening up, looking at things more creatively, ready to adopt risk. Who gets the high marks between those three communities? Can you give us a quick thought on that, Scott?
I think the distinction is a rather false one. I think that fragmentation is the number one killer of good public administration. If the first instinct is to have, okay, here are our strategic objectives. Here's what we're trying to accomplish from a public administration. If I'm the chief operating officer, but if there's a deputy secretary, this is what we're trying to achieve. Ready, go. And the first instinct of the CIO, the CFO, the chief administrative officer, the auditor, is to start arguing. What is that? You can't, I know we all have our communities, and we're proud of our communities, and people come up in their communities, and we want to have achieved this of our community. and we'll have, and there will be laws passed, and there'll be geo studies, and there comes a point where integration across common concerns like budget, risk, transparency, integrity, requires integration. And I commend the folks who preceded me at Treasury and Interior and Commerce and in other agencies that have combined a number of these functions under a person. Because the only person I have to argue with in a number of these things is myself. I have plenty of other people to buy in who I need and must have their support. But to execute in this age of imperative for good public administration, which we all care about, it requires getting beyond these stovepipes and these silos.
Here, so the community is ready to adopt more risk as Mythbusters worked?
Well, I think we are. First of all, we need to recognize this is about business relationships, not reading the part for my customer. I think we've gotten beyond that in my organization. Without my customer, I don't have a reason to exist. So unless I provide customer service, we spend a lot of time training our acquisition workforce in customer service. They know how to do contracting for the most part, but it's a new and different skill set and it's a new day. The same thing goes for industry. We do a lot of industry outreach. The better we communicate what we need, the better we end up with. We end up with better proposals, we end up with better price, because your risk goes down the more information you have. And, it's a win-win formula. I have to make one comment on the government risk and protest. I don't contract for protest avoidance. Personally, I think I will tell you everything you want to know, including why I didn't get the contract. But just don't come in and threaten me. That doesn't do the risk-based, analysis anything. It doesn't help us. But I think this transparency, industry outreach, we do advanced planning, bringing the industry to the IT community, coming up in July again at Eatontown. It's been tremendously successful. We're accessible now because we're all in this partnership together. And I think I would agree that it's part of its acquisition, it's IT, it's HR, it's financial. If we can't play together, we're never going to get there.
Steve?
Well, I think, there are pockets in every agency where this is working well. There are other places where, there's a lot of room for improvement. But I think people are looking at people who are being successful. And I think people are looking for different paradigms in order to get successful. One of the things that we're trying, and we've reached out to industry, we just finished a survey, we're actually trying to manage our supplier base. For the first time, we said, this is a discipline that we need to understand. We have probably close to 20,000 contractors we have a relationship with, and managing and owning that relationship was nobody's job. So now we said, we need to look at this as a discipline. We manage a huge supplier relationship for the entire federal government. We need to look at this much more carefully. So we did a supplier management relationship survey, found out some things about what suppliers thought about working with GSA. Some things we could get better, some things that we were doing well. And, we asked them the questions, we asked them to grade us based on other partners that you have. So, we can see relative to the world in which we live, are we a good partner in this area? Could we be a better partner? Where are we relative to others? And I think these are the things that we're doing. We've always done this with our customers. And I think, the thing we're doing with both of these is then taking this and using it to improve. So we're taking the comments, we're creating action plans around what our customers are telling us they need more of, and what our industry partners are telling us we need more of. And this is how we're trying to improve ourselves to be the kind of partner we want, both with our customers and with the industry.
Shimon?
For my mission around terrorism-related information sharing, improving information sharing, we cannot be successful without a sustained, substantive, deep, ongoing conversation in partnership with industry. Period. We have to work together. There's too many stakeholders. The mandate is to interconnect existing systems. We have to take an interoperability approach. We've had success with the standards-based approach, working with the voluntary consensus, international standards organizations, with industry associations. We have to build on that foundation. Kathleen and I, Kathleen Turco and I, have a request out to ACT-IACT to help give us feedback in terms of how to proceed in the standards-based procurement approach. It's a critical thing. I know that the ACT-IAC folks are looking for volunteers and input. We're in an accelerated schedule, hoping to report out to OMB later in the spring. Lots of opportunities to engage, though. This is an audience focused on acquisition excellence. The ACT-IAC paper is a great place to plug in. If you're a little bit more on a technical bent, get engaged with the standards organizations. If you're on the mission side or the management side of agencies, plug into the governance structures that tier up to the Information Sharing and Access Policy Committee or the Federal CIO Council or the CXO councils that are, housed out of GSA. So there's lots of opportunities to engage. I'll also just throw out a commercial for our website. Go to www.ise.gov, www.ise.gov. If you're looking for opportunities to plug in.
Let's open it to the audience. I think there are roving mics. It's difficult for me to see through the lights. Oh, okay, great. Mr. Dan Chenon.
Panel, thank you. Great remarks. The question that I have is around agility, as we discussed it, and integrity. So a lot of the procurement system exists and the rules exist to protect taxpayers and agencies in particular ways as contracts are led and as work is done. And yet, as we've heard today from you very eloquently, the need for agility to address today's challenges is more important than ever. A number of us, both in government and in industry, have seen well-crafted statements of work that really promote agile solutions that are a good sort of a 5-page statements of objectives. But even at a task order level, they're often followed by many more pages of documentation that really exists to provide for that integrity. And to Scott's earlier point, sort of somehow add additional cost and effort in terms of achieving the result. How do you address the need for agility and the need for accountability without overburdening the system in terms of unnecessary process?
I guess I'm not sure from my perspective that they would be mutually exclusive. I think, credibility and integrity are never for sale regardless of what we do, whether we do agile development or any other strategy. None of those are mutually exclusive in my mind. I think what we have focused on internally educating our customer, focus on the essentials. I mean, I am so used to, I've been in government contracting 23 years. We write statements of work that are a gazillion pages long, and I guess my point is if you can't address it in 5 pages, you probably don't need it. I'm a firm believer in meetings.
Heresy.
Any meeting longer than 30 minutes is counterproductive. If you can't resolve it, get out. So we really, and I think that's part of my acquisition rapid response office, both in IT and non-IT, is help focus our customer on what they truly need and then communicate that. I hope that addresses it.
Shemendra, you have a comment?
Yeah, one of the things that we're looking at in partnership with industry is industry-based certification of conformance with some of the standards we talked about, right? So to the extent that there's a standard that defines common business process or policy, industry implements that standard for products and services. There's an industry-based approach for certified conformance, good housekeeping seal of approval. Then we'll be able to leverage that in the procurement process. That should simplify the procurement process because it's a less risky procurement, right? And it's for standardized requirements. So maybe we don't need to take the same kind of approach in terms of large custom IT developments, but we can take a more streamlined approach. So opportunities like that, I think, can go in the direction of addressing, both sides of that equation.
Jim?
When the administrator spoke, she talked about high performance. We've talked about a lot of things, but I'm not here to speak to commerciality and how you're going to reconcile your growing expectations with commerciality where the government is willing and prepared to make more for things that are no longer commercial. At the same time, we've talked about high performance, and you haven't spoken to the issue of low price technically acceptable, because high performance introduces a concept of best value and risk assessment and acceptance that I haven't heard you speak to, and particularly that fifth party that hasn't been mentioned, the lawyers. You guys can agree. but the lawyers seem to spend more time preventing the government than maybe having a mentality of defending the decisions that rightfully belong to the organizations that you mentioned.
Well, there's a can of dynamite for anybody.
I'd like to start first. Commerciality. I think it's interesting that the trends around consumerization of IT and we were talking about Mr. Jones talking about mobility sort of things. With regards to the work that we're doing with the information sharing environment and our core standards frameworks, things like the National Information Exchange Model, these are utterly cross-cutting best practices around information integration. And we're seeing that proven out, right? The market now is international. Canada has adopted, Mexico has adopted, the European Union is in discussion. I'm meeting with the CIO from Australia. There's an international market. It's being used much more broadly than law enforcement and homeland security. It's being used in health, human services, precision agriculture, just a variety of different applications. And going further, we've been working with mainstream standards organizations, OASIS, the Object Management Group, and so forth. And these standards are now fully adopted by industry. We actually believe that at some point they're going to be used more broadly than even the public sector. But even the public sector is a huge marketplace. Look across state, local, tribal, federal, domains of government, international. So commercialization is a big thing. We're big believers in voluntary consensus standards. That's law, it's policy, it's the right thing to do. The voluntary consensus standards need to be mainstream industry standards.
Scott?
Within our acquisition reform efforts in Commerce, it's no accident that our general counsel, Cam Carey, has been an essential leader from the first day in design, including the systemization of acquisition risk and how best to manage. And a lot of this is engagement again. A lot of it is breaking down the silos and the culture. Reasonable people sitting in a room trying to solve a common problem typically reasonably agree. And there wouldn't be no acquisition reform in Commerce if it weren't for our legal counsel's involvement. But they have to be involved. We got to bring everybody in, and then reasonable people can typically reasonably deal. Otherwise, legal counsels spend lots of time unwinding things that went wrong. And I've found a great openness when you start all from the beginning of how to prevent the wrong thing from happening in the first place.
Go, Steve.
I'm sorry to jump in because I think one of the things you're talking about here in terms of commerciality is the scheduled program, which is the source for many commercial practices and commercial solutions. And we are looking at and developing right now and going to be outreaching to both industry and customers for the next generation of the schedule. We're working on a model that was developed 20 years ago when the government mainly bought products. Now we're buying solutions and services, and we need to look at that and see it about how we transform that schedule into something much more useful for our customers and industry so that industry can bring things to the government much more quickly and efficiently, and the customers can understand how to buy it. The second thing around the legal issues is, I've had conversations with our lawyers about their risk posture. I mean, if I sometimes when I hear about where they went on a particular issue, sometimes it involves having a conversation with them about how much risk we're willing to take. I mean, I don't need to have legal advice for the one odd thing that is going to happen once in a million times to be sure that we will never be in a position where somebody's going to say we did something wrong. But I think we need to look at business decisions around risk, sometimes involving legal, and having those conversations. I had the unfortunate experience of going to law school, but and to understand some of this. But and the lawyers understand this too, that hard facts make bad law. And I think the same thing holds true in policy and the implementation of how we run our businesses or the business of government.
One more?
Okay, last question. There's been a lot of discussion regarding acquisition reform, wherever I have that expression before. But Iris opened up with a comment. She said, we're still educating the industry. We have a lot of industry, a lot of government people here in the room concerned about acquisition. Could you each name 2 or 3 things that you'd like industry to be more educated about? Tell this audience.
Great question. I think what I'm referring to, and this gentleman just kind of touched on it, a lot of times there is a perception when we say best value, we mean low price. I get, vendors coming and telling me that all the time. Please understand our business process. I mean, when I say what I say, that's what I mean. Now, thankfully, through more open communication, I think the feedback I'm getting is, okay, we hear you, we got it, there is more discussion here. I think more industry involvement early on. When I go out with an RFI, I truly want to know the answer. This is not, don't send me your sales brochure and tell me what you can do for me. Pay attention to what I'm really looking for and give us some honest feedback. I mean, that's really what I'm looking for. And I think sometimes when things go wrong, business relationships are complicated. And Scott and I had a discussion early, and you probably noticed I moved back a lot, but I don't wait for a year to give someone poor past performance if there's a problem. I'm the type to pick up the phone and say, there's an issue, what are you going to do about it? Because it costs you money and me money if we don't fix it right away. I think I would expect the same thing from industry. If you see something going wrong on how we're managing this program, don't forget, I'm buying your expertise. Pick up the phone and let us know. Don't wait till somebody sends you a letter and says we're having a problem. So I think this dialogue is a two-way street, and we need to continue that approach.
Go ahead.
I would also echo that communication thing, that it is a two-way street. It's not only government telling you what you need or what we need, it's really giving us information on how we're doing. If you have a problem with the procurement, there's plenty of people to talk to about that, and we do want to know. We do want to improve. I don't think there's a contracting officer in the government that wouldn't like to do their job better. Sometimes maybe they don't understand exactly what they're doing and how it impacts you, and that information is very useful. And two, when we ask for information, we don't want, the typical question we get about, does, a page mean both sides? Come on, we really want information about how you can bring your services to us in a much more cost-effective manner. How can we, when we put on an RFI, help us design that document in a way that will allow you to come in and save you money and bring better value to us. That is so important. And, and we're not going to get there until people start giving us that information. So I think that's really critical for our improvement. And there was something else I wanted to say, and I lost my train of thought. So I'll just pass it.
Yeah, come back. We'll come back around three. Two ideas I'd like to leave you all with. This is a Fed-centric audience. A lot of what we're talking about here is federally focused. Increasingly, and it's beyond my domain in terms of Homeland Security information sharing, we need to be thinking about state, local, tribal, right? And you think about the almost $500 billion in grant dollars that the federal government gives to state and locals. It's multiplied by state and local dollars. It's a huge market, a huge opportunity that traditionally has not been accessible, maybe because it's been fragmented, that we're looking at these standards approaches, new opportunities, new ideas. So think about state and locals as you're thinking about the future. And the second is focus on standards. We're doing some really amazing and innovative work. So as you're thinking about technology and that value chain, going back to the technology providers, the innovation community, upstream, mainstream standards organizations, pay attention to that work. It'll flow into the acquisitions you're looking at here at the federal level, and so forth. So think about that standards work, think about state and locals.
Remember what it was. One of the things that I think industry should do more of, and this involves your own employees and recruiting, is the way you talk about government work. The government work, in many ways, is some of the most interesting, important, impactful work that is going on in this country. Think about what we do with the Defense Department, with Homeland Security, with the Census Bureau. These are important, interesting projects at a scale that is almost unavailable anywhere else. So when you're recruiting, talk about your government work. When you're talking about where to put people in your organization and the opportunities to work on the government work, I think you need to talk about it in a way that I don't think the industry talks about it enough, about how important this work is
and how valuable it is. And when you have that job and task, how important it is for your company. And I think I'd like to hear more of that from industry.
But industry best practice when it comes to looking at project management and risk for agile development. I'd be very interested to know what is considered best practice, and that would help us better, with greater integrity, with greater confidence, with greater transparency in how we're managing programs, so there will be greater willingness to engage in more of them. So best practice in that area. Second, if a consumer buys a stock or a bond, there's a ready place to go to find out what price points are for that stock or bond, relative to risk and duration and other factors. If a consumer buys a home or wants to rent a home, there are ready places to go to find what are good sound price points for similar homes in similar areas and sort of similar attributes. As a buyer of service for our government, I would like to think that I can go to a place and find just as much transparency about, for certain types of goods and services, meeting certain types of purposes, and other basic apples to apples, orange to orange features, attributes. What are the price points? Let's have a marketplace. A marketplace with greater transparency on price will allow purchasing officers within the government greater ability to do what's best in terms of buying. And it's remarkable given the scale of buying that the federal government does. Is there a bigger purchaser in the world, single? I don't know who don't know from Walmart, but it's large. You would think there'd be this amazingly rich amount of information that any purchasing officer could access to determine is this a good price or not relative to other factors. And I sometimes, if I'm perhaps if I'm a vendor, pricing transparency may not be what I always want. Well, I would suggest that the greater transparency we have on price, the better the government is able to negotiate based on with the richer the environment will be, both from an industry perspective, the greater the confidence will be in the entire system from the industry side and certainly from the government side. So let's look at where we are now on that. Let's look where we could be, perhaps looking at other industries as a model, and see how we progress on that path together.
Well, thank you very much for the participation and the interest in the audience, and I hope that we got some tidbits that will survive the conference.
So, thank you